Hi everybody, it's David Shummy from Fixaframe in Brisbane, and we're here today for our regular Framers Club training. Now, we broadcast this over YouTube Live and Google Hangouts. The best output we can get sometimes is at 720p. It depends on the bandwidth that we've got going out of here. We haven't got great internet speeds here in Australia with uploads quite yet, but soon we will. And so what we do is we record this, we back it up on several cameras. We have overhead high definition. Today we've got a little flip cam just for a close-up here, and also we record on high def video, which we then edit up and we put back into the Framers Club membership site. So you can adjust the settings to get the best image you'll receive is down in the little settings tag down there. If it's very, very choppy, or if we drop out, by all means log back in and you should pick up the broadcast quite well. If you've got any questions, I encourage you to leave them in the chat. Occasionally I'll have a little look over there and make sure if there's something that I haven't covered that you can, or something that you'd like to see covered, let me know. In fact, something that I wanted to do just today, before we even get started, I mean, it'd be great if Robert or I know you were online, I was just having a look, if you could type into the, just that you can hear us. And what I was going to do, I was going to just ask a quick question, and it was in relation to what kind of mat cutter that you use. And sorry, bear with me, I should have set this up beforehand, but I just want to add a little to help guide me in the future content that we make for you guys. I just wanted to know, on the people who are actually on the call, and even if you're watching this on a replay or later on, please just pop it into the chat, or if you're on the call, just answer the poll. CMC, I'm just writing a couple of answers here. I'm just asking you guys whether you're using a professional mat cutter or whether you're using a manual type machine. Yeah, so just I've really only added I've added three options there, which if you guys are using one particular thing, like I've sort of asked whether you're using a CMC computer cutter, a professional like a straight line mat cutter like one of the Fletcher or C&H, or something that has bearings in it and, you know, is a large machine that would be used in a professional workshop, or whether you're just using the simple little Logan type hobby cutters like the 301, or, you know, the 401s and things like that, or even just your stock standard hand cutter. It'll just help me in future presentation to work out what you guys use most, and then if you're using a lot of CMC stuff, the computerized cutters, we can look at how we create cutting files for those machines and how we do some of the technical part of decorative mat cutting in computerized machines. But today I have covered in the past, in some of the advanced mat cutting, I have covered some of what we're doing today, but there's a couple of other little things that I just wanted to have a look at and give you guys a few ideas that you might take away and use. We're going to have a look at replicating some antique type mat board designs and how we go about it, how we sort of make up even templates that we use, and you keep those templates. I'll show you how I sort of make my templates. Also, I've got a little we'll have a look at one of the Brian Wolf type hand carved designs. So although you can do some of the carved type mat cutting, quite intricate cutting on the computerized machines, some of the more delicate things a computerized cutter won't handle particularly well. And also, if you don't have, even if you do have one of those machines, you may not have the ability to actually get the design into the computerized cutter. So that's why I sort of also asked the question, to know whether whether you guys are using computerized cutter. Cool. So anyway, first up, I've brought I've got a little map, a little framed picture of my grandparents here. It's a little bit beaten up. The frame's been under the counter for a while, and this has a little decorative cut on it. And what I'll do is I'll pop it up on the close-up and just show you one of these little carved designs. So this is one of the things we're looking at today. So for example, on the corners here of this, or on this mat design, what I've done is I have added, I'll just come back there a little bit, maybe we can get it. Where are we? Where's the best angle? So I've actually added some little carved elements in onto the mat board itself, and added a carved element on the bottom. And in this example, I just left the actual photograph in its original brown sort of cardboard backgrounds that it was in. It was in a little folder, and that is actually all the folder is still inside the frame because I didn't want to particularly take it out. So this was a design, and also what I did is I utilised, and although this frame is quite beaten up, I utilised one of the Larsen Jewel mouldings, this sort of kidney design. And something that I just want to point out, if you're working on calculating based on this pattern, there is a repeating pattern there's a repeating pattern on this frame. And what I did is I worked out my frame size sort of approximately first, and then I tried to cut the frame so that the patterns met in each corner. And after that, then I resized the mat board to actually get the design so that all the patterns matched. And it's worth wasting that little metre or so of moulding to achieve that, in my opinion. Although some people would not go to the trouble of sort of pattern matching the actual design in the frame, but can be done. If you've got flexibility over mat board, you can adjust that size and then adjust your mat to fit so that you end up with perfectly matched patterns. So that's one design that we're going to have a look at today. The other type of design, that a couple of designs and a couple of ideas actually as well that I wanted to put to you that you might like to use. I've cut a few different mats just here, some different rag boards. We're working on 100% cotton rag today, and I have got some suede boards here today. So I wanted to show you a couple of ideas based on cutting the rag board. I like using those rag boards, the Rag 100s, where it's one colour all the way through, particularly when we're doing the carved design, because I don't particularly like the harsh white cut, particularly when you're generally using those on older images. But you can still create fantastic modern designs using the techniques, and you may want to use higher value in terms of contrast colours, but these ones are all quite muted and quite natural. I also cut a little suede one there with a gold bit in it that we're going to have a look at, and I've got a big bit there just that we can use for cutting a pattern. And I also have here one of the dropouts from one of the antique replica mats that we're going to look at today. I keep this handy in the drawer and I use it as a template, but also I wanted to show you how I go about creating some templates. Often when we're replacing these, replacing those style of mats, we will take the old mat board and trace through it. So we've actually got the pattern, or if we see something interesting, we take the pattern. But partly the reason I talk about these shapes today is I want to go into a couple of ideas based on using the waste as your friend when it comes to cutting mat board, because these sort of hand cut designs, they were cut for a reason, and that was largely because some of the mat cutters that they used in the old days weren't particularly good at, say, cutting multiple mats like a double mat, or even necessarily cutting particularly well straight. So in some regards it might have been easier to achieve a decorative cut. So we have a little look at that as well. And of course, I say we're going to look at the Brian wolf type designs. So I may get out the mat cutter if we need to cut something on the mat itself, but primarily the tool of choice today that I'm going to be working with is a scalpel and a stock standard utility knife. Now, utility knife is rarely used. I mean, it's used by picture framers for trimming up boxes, trimming up other bits and pieces, but you wouldn't necessarily consider pulling out a Stanley knife as being your mat cutter of choice. But when it comes to replicating some of the more fluid designs, the Stanley type knife is a useful tool. So we'll come back into close-up in a mo. I just check that everything, we got them there. I'll just end this little one and see if we got anything there. Okay, so just if you guys can see there, half are using CMC computer cutter and half are using professional cutter. No one's using the Logan hobby type. This is good because down the track we'll move from some of the hobby-based training into the more professional equipment. Like I have CNC cutter out the back and large keen cut straight cutter that we use. So we'll look at doing some future training in that area. So thank you very, very much for answering there. And certainly if you're watching this on replay or watching it later, please pop it in the chat, pop it in the chat. It'll email to me, and again, it'll help me get a gauge of where everyone's at. Now, where to start? Let's have a little look first at basic hand cut design utilizing Stanley knife and how I go about generally even making some of these templates up. Now there was a reason why, and starting with some of these designs, I'm actually going to start with one that has a hole cut out of it because it'll be easier for me to line up part of the pattern with something like this. Now, a lot of these designs that are cut like this, you can actually draw them up, and the reason some of these shapes were popular was most of the time where the actual cut was made, the cut started in the waist of the mat board and went into the good bit that you wanted to keep, and it came back into the waist. So you didn't have this problem with sort of having overcuts. A lot of you wanted to finish quite cleanly. So patterns were developed, and I guess framers sort of got the idea that they could design something up to suit a particular picture that they were making. And I guess a number of them would have had favourite, let me just get a sharp pencil there, would have had favourite patterns that they like to work with. And so some of those designs, you know, they might involve having just a simple flowing S-curve. And that's why I cut an oval here earlier, and we're going to do a little scalloping trick that I found is quite effective, and you can actually then gild that, or you can paint it with gold paint. But in designing your boards up, you could utilize the actual oval dropout, and you can also utilize, say, circular dropouts for designing some of these mats. So first up, I'm actually going to draw, I just want to draw a little trace through this line, so I've got a size for the opening on this particular mat, because I'll do the design work on this little piece of black core, just grey mat board. The reason I'm using sort of greys and blacks here a lot of the time when I use too many of the bright colours, we get a lot of glare from the lights, and the cameras don't pick it up so well, particularly on the webcams. But obviously have a look later on the high def backup as well. So I'm just going to come up in on close. So purpose of this, these little marks, I've actually just drawn the length and the width of the mat board, and I could measure and mark where that central point is on the matting. I'm just going to have a look. I didn't even have a look what measurements we'd used. So I'm just going to make a mark there in the centre, because the centre point is a nice finishing section. And so utilising the oval that we'd cut, we can actually come in and, depending on how we set that that board in position, we can use the oval itself to design some of the elements that we might use in a decorative mat. So if I line up my oval cutout where I'd put it on the board there with the central point, I can use that curve there to actually make a line onto this template. And likewise, I can come back around. I just want to flip that one over. I'm making a couple of marks just so I know where to line her up. And so in its simplest form, a little swept design. Now often what we would have done is we might have used a couple of sweeps in the actual pattern itself. So you'd find that you might have a design that runs in this way and has an S curve in it. I'll just draw that freehand just to give you an idea. So how we have this sort of curved shape, and that's much like what we have on our big piece here. So I could take that piece and actually transfer it onto the mat itself in some way to mimic this pattern, or I could take a new design that I draw up on a template itself, and then I would keep those templates to use to draw onto the mat board itself. So if I carry on with that one, and let's say I use the curve again, and we're going to come in and put a little line on the other section. So we want him to come to the peak in here. Take the same design. So that, I might actually already cut that piece out and cut this out just straight. So I'm going to try and cut in a couple of little goes here. I'm not going to try to make this particularly clean, but what I want this to be is the actual template that I use, let's say, to cut this mat. So I can come past this edge, cut a curve, and this is just one that then I'd put away in the drawer and say, okay, well there's a little template that I might be able to use on a 10 by 8, for example. And you keep these, keep things like this on hand. Taking a little bit off there. So for example, I might have a piece that I've made like that, and this side would be relevant, say, to an 8-inch image, and this would be relevant to a 10-inch image, so that we could keep that for future use. And then when we came to our actual mat board, we can take our pattern and we can start to put that pattern onto the board. Which I might even use the longer side. And take 2 cuts out of here. And so now I can line this up on the mat that I want to cut. I just make a little line, make a pencil line. These are going to be the two end cuts. And there's a couple of little things I'll show you with some of the carved designs, just techniques for transferring patterns that I've found quite useful over the years. And in this example we're going to come a little bit closer. I might join that up with a different cut on that end. Just going to join that pattern. Now I tend to just use the lines that I've drawn. I don't try to cut exactly along the line. I generally will use the line as a guide, and I'd often put, again, another straight board on the inside when it's cut. So something like that, if I was going to use the Stanley knife to cut, what I want to do is actually have it on a 45-degree angle, but you do that by resting your hand generally on the board itself. Now you may use a mat cutter, like a handheld mat cutter, to do this sort of pattern, but in this case I'm just going to use the Stanley knife. In fact, what I'm going to do, I'm going to change. I'll leave it as it is. We'll cut one of the other ones in a minute where it comes back into the waste, because this I've had it going cutting into the board itself. So when I'm going to cut, I cut from the face and I just cut just outside the actual line. And I think of the knife a little bit like, almost like I'm going to spread some butter on bread, because I want a springiness, and that springiness stretches from the blade itself up through my wrist to my elbow. So I think of the blade as being an extension of my whole arm, and that way I'm able to get the knife on the angle that I like and just lean it over and get it in and cut. Because usually with something like this, we really want to cut that in one fluid motion. We don't like to go back over. And so I'm just cutting just outside the line, which you can see just here. So I'm not going to have to rub that line out, although we may need to rub some components out. Again, just work my way around. Again, we try to start on the cut. You may need to come in and actually finish some of the corners there. And work your way around. So again, unlike your normal mat cutter where you're working from the back of the board, in these techniques you're working from the face. So you're generally looking at the finish point and thinking that the blade is going to come up on that 45-degree angle at the corner as well. So yeah, we may need to actually finish the corners. Gradually work around. Now this may or may not drop out. I know I'm going to be tight here. I didn't want to overcut. It's the overcuts that kill all sorts of matting. Now just going to, you're going to pop this corner where it just, where we're just caught in the corner, and you'll see there'll be a little tear there, but the tear is still going to be in the waste. And so when I've got something like this little area here, I would come back and actually take that cut out so that we try to end up with that clean. So any corners, particularly where we've met in the board itself, you may need to clean it up. I won't spend too much time on this right now. But what would happen is often a design like that, for example, would either just sit straight on the photograph, or it would be combined with another mat board. Got to clean up that one, I can't leave it like that. And then where we've got a little pencil mark over, I just clean up those. Just clean up any little bits of pencil where you may have. And what I was working with there, that was just a. The pencil was a B. Sometimes we work with. In fact, when I sharpened the lead before, I had a little bit of graphite sill on there, which left a small dark mark on one part of the bevel. What I'll do is I'll pop that back up on the front camera. So often that design, you wouldn't necessarily use that just as it was on its own. What you'd do is you'd pop a secondary cut piece, whether in that case there's an oval, or for example, I'll just use this dark green one because I know it's an inner one that would fit inside this. Oh, actually I'd change the size when I was cutting that one. But you would have a straight cut that would match internally. Did I have that way? I think I changed the size on the suede, but you can get the idea that I'm giving you there. So you can have a standard rectangle, and you can have one that's actually cut in the decoration to match the style of the antique mat. Now the interesting thing about this design, and this is one that that I regularly use, and that is that each of the cuts, it starts in, and we'll trace it onto this piece of board, and as I cut it, you'll see where I'm coming from with a design like this and the logic behind the design. Because if you're coming up with something that's unique for your own work, you may want to actually have a pattern that replicates some of the of what's going on in this one. And I'm just going to trace around it straight onto the face of the mat. Now there are a couple of points where it doesn't actually follow the design, but what happens is when you're cutting something like this, you end up starting your cut in the so we can see it on the board there. You end up starting your cut. So although this is a curve, right, and we might actually use a scalpel to cut it, and the ones that I like to use are the number 11 in the X-Acto, or these are actually a Grifold number 7. Whenever you're cutting something curved design, you want a really pointy type of blade. Now I'm not going to use that to cut this, but as we go on we would use that. I could use it to cut this curve, but the Stanley knife is still more than adequate to cut this curve. And the reason being is to cut that curve, and I'm going to cut the circle first just to give you an idea, is what we do is we think of this cut as sort of a big U shape where we can run from the waist into the good bit of board and back into the waist. So I don't have to start cutting exactly here where the design is. What I do is I start cutting before the design, and as I come into the board, I'm already moving fluidly, and then as I turn around the actual cut itself, I don't have to worry about the finish point, because the finish point I'm going to run just off into the board here. So I've cut quite a big circle out, and then when I want to cut this straight line, it's the same thing. I can start in here in the actual waist of the board. So I can start right in this cut. Whoop, tighten that up a bit. I can start right in this cut, and I can come through that join up to the point. And likewise, if I was coming, I'll come along here, I'll cut these other pieces. If I was cutting here, I don't need to worry about where I finish because I'm cutting into the waist. So it makes the cutting a lot easier. Likewise, this beautiful sort of French curve, S-curve that we've got here, you can start and run very smoothly along the design, and as you get to the end of it, you don't have to worry because you're cutting right back in here into the waist. Same, when we start, we're going to hit the join, and so you end up with a really smooth, fluid cut. Likewise here, straight into the waist. Now we're back to this beautiful curve again. So it's starting, I have to turn around this way a little bit because I have to get my rotation going on this on the table. But what I'd be doing, I'm cutting, sort of imagining I'm cutting an oval really, except I'm only cutting, say, 3/4 of the oval, or half of the oval, but the design actually is finishing there. So up into the pattern, and that would be off into the next curve. So all these big overcuts that we've got are in this waist section that's coming out in the middle, and not, just let me have a look where I'm caught there. All the actual, again we'd rub the design out. So when we had a mat board like this, because this point is on the inside, because the curve runs onto the inside, there is not a lot of area where you have, for example, I've got a slight overcut right here where I've come into that corner. Now I could actually come back and take another little slice off that so that we'd get rid of it, but you can see how the pattern itself is built around the idea that you start in the waist, cut into the board and back into the waist again. So these can be traced up and put into a computer cutter, but what I suggest you do is you make a few designs up like this, and or if you see any that come into your shop and you have to actually replicate them, make tracings of them, keep those patterns, because when you get an old frame or old picture, or you want to replicate something where they've lost the mat board, you can go and pull out one of these patterns and copy it. Josie's asking what I am cutting on. Well, right here, this is actually, okay, this is just a piece of standard black mat board. I'm using, and again, normally I wouldn't be, I'm not too concerned about what I'm cutting on. You normally would cut on just everyday white mat board. The reason I'm just using a black, this is a black foam rubber that we actually, it's a non-marking rubber. I don't know what they use it for, but I found it in a, we have a sort of a rubber supplier, and they had this stuff, and it was said non-marking foam, and I thought, oh, that sounds interesting. So I bought a few rolls of the stuff, and we use it on some of our benches just for working, for fitting up, and it doesn't tend to mark the frames, and they don't slip around. It's really good. We find it better than carpet or anything like that, and again, it cleans very easily, so we get all the dust off. But this piece of board that I'm cutting on is just black mat board, white on this side, but as I say, the cameras tend to flare up a bit if we're using bright colours, so I've just been cutting on black mat board, and you can see I've chewed it up a bit. I probably have come through in a few areas because I do actually put reasonable pressure on that blade when I'm cutting, and it's not so much pressure of cutting through the board, it's that spring pressure that I was telling you about. So I'm actually thinking of this blade as a big spring, and I'm thinking of that whole section of my arm, so that I'm actually applying almost I'm thinking I want to keep that blade under spring tension the whole time, more so than sort of forcing it through the board. And that's something, if you're going to cut straight mat boards with a Stanley knife, you need to actually apply that downward pressure, not sort of the through the board pressure. So make up a couple of patterns like this, write a little design on the back. It's not something that you do every day, but we actually see a reasonable amount of that kind of work coming through our business, because what happens is we do photo restoration, stuff like that. We have a digital guy here. So a lot of people are it's now getting to the point where all of those photos are coming out of the woodwork, because the people who have since passed on have left some of these pictures to their relatives, and then they get pulled out and they go, oh, that was great grandfather there, and they had some of these mat boards on. So I think there's still going to be that trend for nostalgic type framing, and although you can import that into your CMC cutter, you can program it to cut these sort of patterns, something about some of the hand cut is almost a little bit more unique, and can be a lot of fun to do if you enjoy doing that sort of stuff. So we'll have a look at a quick one here now, which, well, it's not so quick, but we'll have a little look at some of the carved patterns. And Brian Wolf, who, if any of you have followed framing for any length of time, Brian Wolf would do a lot. He was a left-handed mat cutter, which is quite funny because most of these straight line professional machines are designed for right-handers. And the first time I saw him cut was like, this was like so weird, because he was a lefty and he was using a right-handed mat cutter backwards by pushing with his left hand, and he was really fluid at it, and it was quite an amazing sight to watch someone cut and gain or use a machine differently to the way I was always using a mat cutter, by looking and pulling towards me and having that sort of look. He sort of had this flowing push action, and he sort of developed quite a number of different, quite nice designs. You can pick up some of his books, different ideas, and I wanted to share with you that style of cutting. I don't claim to be anywhere near as good as some of the handmade stuff that he's done over the years, but there are a few designs that I like to use, and I like to use them on some more not antique photographs, but those vintage photographs where they just want a nice little touch. And when I was just getting set up today, I was going through some of my reference material and having a look, and I actually found this little piece of tracing paper. And this piece of paper here is about not 20 years old, but maybe 16 years old. And the actual pattern, there is a pattern on here, and I'll hold it up to you close and show you it, because this was one that I based on one of, I didn't base it on Brian Wolf's design, but I was actually having to frame for Chrysler. Were coming into Australia and opening up in a dealership here. and they had some beautiful pictures of the Chrysler building and some of the old Chrysler cars. And so this actual pattern matched the pattern on the Chrysler building. And then what happened is that design got put onto a mat board that sort of lined up here. You can actually see on the, you may not be able to see, but there are actually straight lines here which corresponded to V-grooves. So the design itself ran into a little double V-groove that then ran around, the double V-groove ran around the bottom, and the single V-groove ran around the top, and this little pattern ran up the sides, and we had the beautiful Chrysler building, and then the other vintage vehicles that were in it also had this sort of Chrysler emblem on it. So that was an example of using something that kind of was a vintage look. And there is actually a pattern on here that that we're going to cut today, which is this little sort of, it's almost like a trying to think, a treble clef type pattern. It's got a little scroll in it, and this is designed to run with and next to a V-groove as well. So what I'd already done previously was I'd cut a V-groove there. So this is some of the 100 rag, so it's brown all the way through, and again, I like these sort of antique colours when we're doing this sort of work. But this is the tip. It's more so than cutting today, because there are little things that actually make things easy. You do not have to use tracing paper for this. You know, often I'll use a piece of paper, but this is actually quite a thick, like a 200 gram tracing paper, and the design is just drawn on there, again, with a lead pencil. Now the thing about this design is, because the design is put on, and I'll draw it onto the board and show you what I mean. The design is drawn on one side, and then all you do is you put your pattern down onto the paper, and I just want to make sure I can see these V-groove lines, because there's a line, I've just extended this dark line so that you can probably see it a little bit better, but that line and the one at the top, I want to line up with my V-groove, and so I'm going to put that in line. And in fact, what I'm also going to do, I'm going to make a line here, just so that I've got a reference point for the bottom of my mat board. So I'd line up the two lines that are under here, which with my V-groove, and then I'm going to trace just onto this pattern. And the thing about this is, once you've done this once, you may need to do it one time on the when you first do it, and then after that you'll just go back and use the same pattern all the time. So all I've done is I've gone over that pattern with my lead pencil. And now it hasn't come through incredibly well, because it's probably been a number of years since I've actually used that one. So we'll come back and do that in a sec. But the way we get the pattern to the other side is, all we do is we turn the paper over. So we don't need any carbonized paper or anything. What we're doing is we're using the transfer effect of having the lead on one side of the paper and coming back through. Hope you can pick up on that. So this is just one design element, and you can come up with a whole lot of your own. It really, you know, there's all sorts of little things you can do like this that just add such a nice little touch. So that one's a little bit clearer. Now it's not incredibly strong pattern on the board, but again, I don't really want a lot of dark pencil on the board there, and in fact I can actually see where I'd drawn this other one, although it's fairly faint. You'd probably want and I've seen when Brian's cut designs like this, the actual straight parts, and on here we've got a straight section that's running, I'm just going to put my ruler on there. We've got a straight section that's running here. I'll just draw it a little bit stronger. and we've got a straight section that's running here. Now these are about 3 mil or 1/8 of an inch or something apart. Just going to rub it out a bit. What he would do is he'd actually cut those straight sections on the mat cutter, and then use so you'd cut that straight line right down here just on the mat cutter itself. I'm not going to do that today. I'm just going to use the scalpel. So what I've got a pattern on this side. I've flipped it over and I've got the same pattern on the other side. And this is where we go in and we use our scalpel. Very important that you have a sharp blade. So you'll go through a lot of blades. You're much better off having a sharp blade when you're doing this sort of work, because otherwise you won't get a good result. So we'll try and get it on a good angle so that you can see where I'm going with this. There are sections here where it's going to be cut through the board, and there are sections where it's going to be a V-groove. So basically what we're going to do is cut around this pattern both ways. So first up, I'm going to come from the V-groove itself, where I'm starting up here, and I'm doing the same sort of thing. And the trick here is my middle finger is actually sitting on the board itself, and my middle finger is providing the 45-degree angle that you want the blade to be at. So if you think the finger is going to always sit on the board and the blade's going to try to be on the same angle all the time. So that's why you see my finger here. You may actually not catch how I apply the pressure to it, but what happens is I'll come around here, try and get around this end of the table so we can get a good look at it. I'm going to line it up on that little start mark in the V-groove there, and then I push my scalpel in and I just follow that line. And then now I'm not trying to cut, I'm really not trying to cut all the way through the board here. All I'm trying to do is cut, and I can see why he would cut this one with the mat cutter rather than freehand, although I'm just cutting that line freehand. And then I'm going to start to turn into this little pattern and take my blade out. So I've run all the way from there down one side. Same, I stab in with the knife and I come down on to a little point, and then we're going to come back the other way. So I've cut all down that design one way, now I'm cutting in here. Now that piece here will actually come out. So this little section is going to be a cut through, and you can see there's a little hole in there. Now there's a little thing I'm going to show you. You can actually put a colour in there. You can put the same colour, or there's a little trick where you use a piece of gold mat board, just the foil off the top of it. We'll take a piece off one that I've got here and I'll show you how it works. So then I come back in and I'm running along that line the other way, and I'm hand cutting a V-groove here. Now it's a sort of thing where I don't do this every day, but usually I'll get into it in some way, at least, you know, once a month or something like that. I might have a decorative one to do like this. And of course, the more you do, the better you get at actually producing those designs. So I've just cut that first section. It really doesn't look like much at the moment because it's just a little line down here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come around and cut this curve. Curves are probably the hardest, or a full circle. Some of those curves are hard to do because you actually have to flow with it. So I'm going to go around this curve up the top here. I'm going to cut quite quickly here. And the trick is to just try and rotate. I mean, I'm rotating the board a little bit, but you want to actually try and move your hand around. So yes, you want to have a flow to it. Like when you get a flow going, the curves are so much nicer. And yes, you can do all sorts of designs if you just give it a go. So now I'm actually going to take a cut through the board here. So there's a little straight cut there. And come back and lift out that section. So you can go back in. It's not like you have one cut at it and it's done. I'd actually like that to be a little bit deeper. Anyway, I'll come back, we'll work on that in a sec. And this is the one I find the hardest, which is the inside curve. So I'll get my hand round in this funny angle. It's a bit obscure, but I've got to put my blade in. And again, it's a little bit tricky because you've got to keep that angle going and cut on the inside. So generally I'll hold my breath when I do that actual motion. Cutting external curves, so much easier than the internal ones. So again, little curve there, and come back in, down into this point. Now you can see I can peel off this layer. Now I'm still not all the way through, so just come back into that section. That blade, I've just lost the tip of the blade. Just want to pinch one out of this knife. It's like keeping the might even use it in that knife. It's funny, I like the other handle better, but we'll go with this for a sec. So this whole section here is actually a V-groove. I can take out the lines. We've got the little cut throughs. Now, I won't cut the other side at this stage because you get the general idea for how this works. Just use a little bit of rubber. I like the art gum rubbers. They're fairly crumbly, but they tend to not hurt the rag board too much. And so what we've got here, in fact, I'm going to cut that little. Come back the other way this time. I just want to cut that curve out. That was a little curve there, and there's a little curve on the top of this one. Okay, so you can see this little pattern that I've put into the board, and then what you can do, if you take some, this is just, I've got a gold mat board here that I was going to show you something else on, but this is a couple of tricks you can use. Often you can take a section of the board itself, so I'm just cutting a little, I've just scored the paper, and then what you do, just take this top layer, like that. So here I've got this little bit of gold that's just stripped off the surface of the mat. Now that little bit of gold is what we can put in behind here, and you use as the little highlights in your cutouts. So I'd just use a couple of little pieces of gold like that. In fact, that piece of gold would probably do both there and there where I did the cut throughs, and all I do on top of that is put a little bit of the Filmoplast tape. So already using acid-free mat board. The gold one's acid-free. I'd be taking that little bit of Filmoplast, I'll be popping it on there like that, and then that's going to hold the little gold bits that become the design on the mat board. And then when you're done, you'd end up cutting the design on this side and the design on that side. So that's sort of the Brian Wolf hand carved mat. And you can take this to a whole new different level if you want to make cutouts. Often he'd do little cutouts into the board, or any sort of pattern. But find one that you can work with, find a design that you like, and give it a go, because it's quite a unique look, and certainly if you're in a nice little touch. So that one's a little bit clearer. Now it's not incredibly strong pattern on the board, but again, I don't really want a lot of dark pencil on the board there. And in fact, I can actually see where I'd drawn this other one, although it's fairly faint. You'd probably want, and I've seen when Brian's cut designs like this, the actual straight parts, and on here we've got a straight section that's running, I'm just going to put my ruler on there, we've got a straight section that's running here, I'll just draw it a little bit stronger, and we've got a straight section that's running here. Now these are about 3 mil or 1/8 of an inch or something apart. Just going to rub it out a bit. What he would do is he'd actually cut those straight sections on the mat cutter, and then use so you'd cut that straight line right down here just on the mat cutter itself. I'm not going to do that today. I'm just going to use the scalpel. So what I've got a pattern on this side, I've flipped it over, and I've got the same pattern on the other side. And this is where we go in and we use our scalpel. Very important that you have a sharp blade. So you'll go through a lot of blades. You're much better off having a sharp blade when you're doing this sort of work, because otherwise you won't get a good result. So we'll try and get it on a good angle so that you can see where I'm going with this. There are sections here where it's going to be cut through the board, and there are sections where it's going to be a V-groove. So basically what we're going to do is cut around this pattern both ways. So first up, I'm going to come from the V-groove itself, where I'm starting up here, and I'm doing the same sort of thing. And the trick here is my middle finger is actually sitting on the board itself, and my middle finger is providing the 45-degree angle that you want the blade to be at. So if you think the finger is going to always sit on the board and the blade's going to try to be on the same angle all the time. So that's why you see my finger here. You may actually not catch how I apply the pressure to it, but what happens is I'll come around here, try and get around this end of the table so we can get a good look at it. I'm going to line it up on that little start mark in the V-groove there, and then I push my scalpel in and I just follow that line. And then now I'm not trying to cut, I'm really not trying to cut all the way through the board here. All I'm trying to do is cut, and I can see why he would cut this one with the mat cutter rather than freehand, although I'm just cutting that line freehand. And then I'm going to start to turn into this little pattern and take my blade out. So I've run all the way from there down one side. Same, I stab in with the knife and I come down on to a little point, and then we're going to come back the other way. So I've cut all down that design one way, now I'm cutting in here. Now that piece here will actually come out. So this little section is going to be a cut through, and you can see there's a little hole in there. Now there's a little little thing I'm going to show you, you can actually put a colour in there. You can put the same colour, or there's a little trick where you use a piece of gold mat board, just the foil off the top of it. We'll take a piece off one that I've got here and I'll see it on that actually. I'll give it another whack. But what happens is you get this little embossed pattern. Now all you need to do is build a sequence of patterns, much like you would tool a leather belt, and you can use any of those sort of tools to add embossed patterns to mat boards. It's a little bit time consuming, but again, for that unique piece, and a lot of these sorts of things are for small items, and if you can actually increase the value of the small things that you frame, it's much more financially rewarding than trying to necessarily, when someone's got a small piece, how do you actually get a greater return for framing that that little item. So if you can add decorative touches enable you to charge a premium, and particularly if they're handmade. So think carefully about how you can do it. One of the other quick ones I wanted to share with you was utilising the surface of boards. And I was doing a job the other day where I made a backing for it was a nice sort of Venetian mask and quite a deep box, and this was just left over from last night. We were actually finishing it off for a client for this weekend, and what I did was I'd wrapped the back of the box, as it did actually protrude a little bit out of the back of the frame and we didn't have enough of an extender, so I wrapped the back with suede, and I'd stripped this suede much like I showed you where I just stripped the gold off the surface. Well, I've stripped this suede off the surface of the green mat by just getting in and picking at it and pulling it off. Now, interesting things about this are that on the back of that, like you can get a piece of this and apply to the back of it some double-sided tape. So in this case, what I'm going to do, I'm going to pop a couple of little layers on here. I'll give you a little. This is just a little decorative one. If we actually put some double-sided tape, I'm going to line up a couple side by side. You can just use single little strips of this and cut it as you go, but I find it's easier if you make up some adhesive board as such out of the suede. So either fabrics, or this is some of that suede mat board. And again, if you're using these products and it's already an archival product, you're going to produce quite a good result from a protection point of view, even though the mat board is now decorative. So with that design, I would then flip that over and I'd cut it on the other side. I'm just going to cut down a straight line first up. Now you'd measure this up. I'm going to be pretty lazy right now. I'm just going to eyeball myself a strip. So what I've got there is a strip of mat that I've got my release paper on the back, and that's what I was doing with this gold mat board. I just wanted to give you an idea. I'd cut 3 mats. We'll come and have a look up close. So I'd cut 3 mats here, 2 out of the suede and a little gold one that was going to go in between. So it's going to be a triple mat board, much like so. And I thought, oh, what would be quite nice is how could I get a pattern to run somewhere on here to add another level of decoration to it. And if you've cut these strips, you can cut them up into smaller pieces. Like I'm only going to need sections that are about that long. for example. And on the gold mat, so we'll keep the suede ones out of the way for a second. I would measure it because you want the thing to look even. So, for example, if I came in, say the 30 mil, and I make a little pencil line at 30 mil just so I've got a guide to work to. What you can do is you take that double-sided tape that you've applied to the back of the board, it's like a lot of these I should actually finish them and then just say this is how you do it, but this is done in real time. So what I can do is I can use the adhesive that I've applied to the back of the board. I take my adhesive layer off, so now I've got a sticky bit of suede board, and I can actually put it in line with my pencil line that I'd done, and in this case I'm going to line up sort of a 45-degree angle, and I can wrap and fold that suede around my gold piece. So we've just put a little tab on there. Take the next one. Now there are all sorts of things you can do with this. You don't have to use it as a wrap over bevels. You can actually use them as strips on top of mat board. So it's quite interesting when you have a strip on the top of the mat board, you can get this sort of raised stripe going on, which is quite interesting. So you don't have to have, for example, you can use that as an application onto the top of the same coloured suede. You can wrap this around other pieces of mat board to make raised embossed sections. There's quite a lot of... I'm just going to cut these last like so, and then we'll split them in the middle when we've stuck them on. So hopefully you can get this. I'm just going to cut that section and then wrap. Stick the next corner. So I'm sticking them now diagonally across the corner and then just trimming. Line up our little pencil marks that we'd made. Oh, wrong side. Got to pay attention when you're framing. Cut in the centre, fold them over. Pull that one a little bit tighter. You can see where I'm going with this, how I've added these pieces. Now it looks a bit odd at this stage, but once we apply this last piece and we wrap it round, you'll see where the design comes together. And again, you can add sections. You can put one of these into the middle if you want. You can add them anywhere. It's more just a case of how you use little bits and pieces that you've got to add a nice decorative enhancement and also value. So our inner mat would be here, right? And our outer mat is going to come on top like so. And so the actual pattern takes that design through from your outer to your inner mat. I'll put that up on the big screen. So just by utilising the two-colour mat and the gold, and then when that's glued together, you get this nice little decorative corner that is just made out of the surface paper. Now, you can take that to any sort of level. If you take the board itself and you actually want to have raised sections, like it's quite interesting. Say you wanted to put a plaque onto this mat, you could just put the plaque straight on the mat board, but sometimes plaques are offset, or you want to have different decorative elements involved. It can be quite easy to take either a one-ply layer, or in something like this, if I cut another strip off this one, I'll just give you a quick look at it. If I cut a strip off this one, I can add that as a decorative element. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to take the adhesive off and I'm going to fold it in. So rather than use the whole edge as it is, I can fold that mat over onto itself. So I'm just folding the fabric or the suede section. And what this does is it makes it thicker. So we end up with a thick suede edge. Fold the other side. So I'm folding that in the same distance. So I'm ending up having a strip of suede that is going to be about 10 mil wide, but it's now raised to the thickness, not of a mat board, but probably half the thickness of a mat board. And you see where this comes into its own. So now what I've got is I've got a suede strip that I have got the folded edge over. Now that suede strip can go on the mat board surface. So if I wanted to add something, a decorative line or a decorative series of lines, I can actually glue that on with more double-sided tape, and you could have a series of patterns that you create by running strips of mat on top of the surface. So just another little tip there. Now, I don't know whether I've got anything else that I really wanted to show you today. I wanted to really run through the idea of utilising the cutting in the waste, so that you cut from the waste into the mat and back into the waste. I also wanted to show you the little scalloped edge, because that can work really well. Like it's not a difficult technique to get a handle on, and certainly if you go and you actually paint the scallops gold, it gives you that sort of hand scallop look that was very popular on mirrors. Certainly in the 30s and the 40s, they liked that sort of scalloped mirror. So a lot of the photographs of that era will look good with a scalloped edge. Doesn't have to be an oval, can be a rectangle, could be any shape. I wanted to show you the hand carved designs, because a lot of the time, really, there you need to get in. Use things like, there are things like Laura Ashley design books. There are William Morris designs. There are certainly a lot of Art Nouveau designs out there. And what you do is you look at those designs, take a pattern from them, and then make them into a design that you can incorporate in a mat board. And what happens is, if you start to do some of these things, so like a lot of the time you might frame Art Nouveau prints. If you have a repertoire of Art Nouveau designs that you've already sort of practiced in, you keep your skill level up, and you start to do some of that more adventurous cutting, you can then translate that into added dollars if you're selling it as a service. But more importantly, it's taking you away from the everyday boring framing that maybe, or maybe it's not boring. I'm not saying that it's boring, but once you start to do some of those more advanced decorative things, you add another element where you do need to keep your skills up, and it isn't just pushing a button and the computer actually produces the result. Now that might seem strange, because a lot of the time commercially you want to be able to produce things quickly, but it's nice to be able to combine, say, computer cutting with some hand elements in there, because then it doesn't look necessarily like it's machine done, and it does look like it has had some loving care and attention applied to it. So I haven't got a lot more to show you today. I just wanted to give you those as a few tips, and you know, if there's any questions. We got one there, Stephen. What's the easiest way to cut an oval? Okay, usually nowadays it's push button simple, because most people are using CNC cutters, certainly in the industry, with cutting ovals. The old type oval cutting machines that were out there were the old C&H type oval cutter. Involved two big cast iron clamps that would come down and hold basically the board itself, and you had an elliptical mechanism built into the actual machine, and then you turn the handle and work gradually down into the board. And that type of oval cutter would normally cut in a couple of passes, sometimes one pass, but normally 2 or 3 passes. Keen Cut had a similar one, which was again a large oval cutting machine. It would cut circles and ovals depending on how you set the differentials. I think when I bought that machine when I first started with the manual oval cutter, and it was more expensive than a straight line cutter. At the time I think it was about $2,500, and we're talking back in the early 1990s. That machine, when I eventually sold it to somebody, had not even paid for itself in oval cutting over the life of me using the machine. So if you're doing simple ones, and I noticed on the shelf behind me, I'll just grab one. If you're doing simple oval cutting, you can use Fletcher. Fletcher will make a big oval cutter, but Fletcher also make a little hand oval cutter, as do Logan's oval cutter. These things, get them out of here. There are restrictions. With what one of these little Logan oval cutters will do, but generally they call it a 3-step cutter. It will cut circles and ovals, and if I can show you up on close-up if you haven't seen one of these. We'll have a quick look. So this is the little Logan oval and circle cutter. Now in the center here is a differential scale. So there are restrictions on these little types of machines. Now for example, if I pull that all the way along, or when it's in the middle there, and you set your the size of the opening here. So at the moment, when this is in the center here, it will cut a circular cut. But to cut an oval with this, what we do is we set our width. So I've got a scrap bit of board. I'll cut one for you. So for example, if I was going to cut say a 6 by 8 inch oval, on here on the scale, I would read it at the 6 inches. And then in the center scale here, what I do is I adjust this central bar, and there's a little measuring stop here. I would set that to 2 inches, right? So you can see here, it's hard, maybe a bit hard to see, but there's a little 2 in there. So that is actually then the difference between the width. Just try and get it in the right spot. Tighten it up. So that is the differential between the height and the width. So now it would cut an oval. And what we'll do, we'll pop it on here. We'll just pop a little bit of board on there. We'll give it a go. For example, when you're actually going to cut the oval, let me have a look. Oh, this is good. I just want to grab a different colour because that was always flary on the screen. So when you're cutting an oval, you'd normally size your board up, and you would draw on the board. And I'm not measuring up anything for you here to actually do an outside cut. I'm just going to show you the central cut. So you would mark on the board an actual cross, and that cross is the centre of where you want the oval to go. So you can work out your external size on there. I've just put the X in the middle, and then on the Logan cutter, and this is the same on the little Fletcher machines, what happens is there are a little notch. I'll try and show you. There's a little notch just sticking out here, and there's a notch on the tip there. So there's 4 notches, and on the bottom are these nasty little pins. So you've got to be a bit careful that you don't actually stab yourself in the finger, but there are 4 little pins. Now the trick with getting that set to cut is we have to line up, and I'll turn this around a little bit so maybe I can get a different angle on it for you on the camera. What we've got to do is we've got to line up the notches that are on that machine with the X that you're drawn on the board. So that's going to get us into a central position. You then push in the pins. So now that's set on the board, and at this point, I just should have checked that we had the blade in there in the right spot. Normally the blade is all the way up, and there's a little wheel. I'm going to take him off a sec, just have a little look. We'll put it back in a sec. I just want to make sure that I've got things right before we go into it. Okay, so on this there's a lever here on the oval cutter. So some work the other way around, some you pull down, some you push up. This one is designed to, you have it pushed down to start with. So that's going to give us this small wheel that's here. And this wheel's going to run around on the board inside the window. So I'm going to get this back lined up in the holes that I just made where we pushed it in. So we always start at the 9 o'clock position, or at least I do. You then run around. So I'm just pushing on the machine. I hold the middle and I push the arm around. And I'm not cutting at this stage. All I'm doing is I'm going around to make sure it's looking like it's going to do the shape I want. And now I'm going to push a little bit harder, but I'm still not cutting. Oh, don't want to cut. That just put the blade in. What that's done, and you probably won't pick up on it, but the little wheel that's there has now embossed a small track. And I find with these type of hand cutters, you really want to make sure that you've actually got a sort of track there already before you go and start putting the blade in. So that runs around. Now when I get to the 9 o'clock position, this lever on the back of this cutter, I'm just going to click it up 1 notch, and this is why they call this a 3-step cutter. So now I've put the blade in 1 step, and what that's done, that started to cut into the board. Now then when I come around again, I can push the blade in a little bit further, run around. When I get round to the last one, I put the blade in all the way, so I've pulled that lever all the way up. I'm applying a little bit of downward pressure with this other hand over here, pushing down on the end of it. That's to keep that blade cutting into the board. Oh, shouldn't lift up there, that was not good. I might have made a notch. And then when I've come around that final time all the way around, this board, no, I'm not quite there. Let me just check. Sometimes I might have something underneath here that I shouldn't have. You obviously want to work on a harder surface when you're actually cutting matte. It's not best to be cutting on a soft one. But once you go all the way around, that should come out. Now I haven't cut here, and whether that's because I just have a blunt blade, I'm just going to rip it out. So right here I haven't cut all the way through, but we should end up with a very clean oval, much like the other one that I've cut. Where I've actually pulled it out here, and I've got this little rough edge, and this is one little tip. Always have handy some aluminium oxide, or preferably the aluminium oxide paper, with sandpaper, which is a white sandpaper, and usually this in 320 grit. 240 to 320 grit is excellent for actually working on the bevel. This is actually some 150, so I'm not going to use it, but I have got a little bit of softer one here, but it's not aluminium oxide. But that, I could use that to just sand, just gently. Where I'd not cut, and you often find, like on I could just see a little line where I'd cut a bit funny there, so I'm going to work my way around and actually take it off. Would be a little bit better with a new blade, but what I've done is I've cleaned up that edge, and where you have your little step, like occasionally you'll get a step mark, which is where, and in fact I can see one, it may not show up too well on the camera, but there is a slight little step here, which is where the blade first came into the board. At that point you'd want to come in and just sand it up. So computerized cutter is the way to go with any cutting nowadays, more so than manual, but obviously not everybody has access to computerized cutters. I certainly, if I was going into business competitively nowadays as a picture framer, starting out, I would try to have enough capital that I could get a computerized cutter from the go, because you know you'd be right in there. You've got to compete on that level. Other than that, if I was doing it as a small business in a small place, and I didn't need to, I certainly would invest in a big expensive oval cutter. You know, maybe a good straight line professional matte cutter if that's the go for you. But oval cutter, I'd almost say you could get away with one of these for the amount of ovals that get done. The only restriction, or there are restrictions with all sorts of things. This cutter actually will cut bigger circles and bigger ovals than some of those big professional machines. But the problem with this and the Fletcher one is they both only go up to a 3-inch differential, which is 75 mil. And what that means is that you can only cut an oval that is 3 inches longer than it is wide. So for example, you couldn't cut a 20 by 16 oval, which is a standard 20 by 16 is a fairly standard photographic, you know, like a family portrait size photograph. So you could only cut, say, a 17 by 20. You couldn't cut the 16 by 20, it would have to be 16 by 19. So it doesn't have that full sort of differential where you get into more than 3 inches. But for your everyday circles, like tapestry, needlework, people that do circles, and some of the ovals would be covered by this machine. and then you'd probably try and find someone to help you if you needed something that was a different size than what they would cut. But I wouldn't be probably investing in, you know, $3,000 worth of oval cutter when, you know, if you were going to go down that path, you would put your straight line cutter, which we do still use on occasion, but not often. I would seriously consider just not having a professional straight line cutter. I would have a little Logan machine for the odd thing if the power went down and I needed to cut a small mat board for someone. But then I would have a computerized cutter, and I would use my capital from the two machines to go into getting one of the computerized cutters. And that way, even if you didn't, you know, you'd get one on a lease and you'd work that way. You know, you'd save your capital rather than investing in old technology. You know, it's much the same with the way everything's going. You really want to be investing in the best technology. So some of this decorative stuff is where you can differentiate yourself as a framer. But when it comes to everyday, you know, basic cutting and stuff, computer cutting is definitely the go. So in some future training, I am still working on Master Framer Academy, which the last 50 days have been crazy for me. My lovely wife has been away in China, both on a little bit of business and actually seeing family. So I've been looking after two kids under 4, or the 4-year-old turned 4 just last week, and my wife actually comes back tomorrow. So I have not been able to put a lot of time into developing some of that other content, although I have been, you know, writing content, but I haven't been filming. But we do have the structure in place, so that more advanced stuff will come along. And certainly through Framers Club, I will continue to do training that involves more advanced techniques. I do have a very complicated restoration job that I was thinking of sharing with you today, but I was already set on doing a little bit more hand cutting. Some of the other things that might be of interest are mirror TVs. We've seen an upswing in trend of people buying or wanting to have televisions framed and have mirror TV, which is when it's on, it's a television. When it's off, it's a mirror. So we have the glass here that actually facilitates that, but there are some techniques involved in framing them, some complications, and so we may share those with you if you're interested. So any of those, anything that you'd really like to do during Framers Club, it's really wise to send me an email or to leave it in the chat, because what happens is, you know, I thought last month we did framing pastels. Now that framing pastels, it was something that seems very basic because we do it every day, day in and day out, but there are some techniques that were shown there that you may not have been aware of or may not have done, and that suggestion came from one of the club members. So suggestions for what you need to learn and the type of equipment that you want to work with is important, because then I follow what you ask. If you request these things, then I try to find jobs that either match those requirements so we can demonstrate the technique, or I go out of my way to try and get that happening. So really important for you to tell me what you need during these training times. We'll be planning a lot more throughout the year. There's a couple of people that always come in and actually are really just getting started in framing. They might have done some basic training with me, and I often invite them to come along to watch some of the Framers Club training so they get a feel for some different areas. And then if they want to join, I will just pop up. This is just an advert. A couple of things. I should have actually, we do have Framers Resource Kit, which some of you guys probably already have got. But what I'm going to do, I'm just going to pop up into the screen there the actual link for the Framers Club. So if you're on this call as a guest and you actually wanted to become a member, you get access to all the archive footage, you get everything else that's in there. Plus each month you get more live content, and as we go on, we'll try and squeeze in more different pieces of content that you demand. So I've just popped that up on the screen if anybody needs it. So if there aren't any questions, I can see we've had a few people online today live, and normally we get also a ton of you on the replay because the time here, time difference from Australia. But I really appreciate you guys for showing up, and certainly for participating in today's training. So we'll sign off right now, and I'll see you next month. Same bat time and same bat channel, usually second Saturday of the month at 2 o'clock Queensland time, which is Greenwich Mean Time plus 10. But I send you guys out notifications when they're coming. And certainly between now and then, if there's anything you want to learn, let me know. Let me know by email, let me know in the chat, and we'll see you next time. We'll catch you then.